It's 1 year since the brutal Gaza war began, with over 40,000 lives lost, mostly women and children. When will this tragedy end, and who will end it? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, the war in Gaza is entering its second year. On the 7th of October, Hamas launched an attack in Israel, killing over 1,200 people. The response from the Israeli military has been deadly and unrelenting.
They were civilians, young men, civilians. Why did they kill them? Why? Why did they fire a rocket at them? Why did they bomb them to pieces like that? Why?
Gaza is over, Gaza is dead, Gaza has gone, there is nothing left.
Screams of anger, pain and misery are now part of life for people living in Gaza. October 7th marks 1 year since the war in Gaza began, following Hamas's surprise attack, after which the Israeli authorities claimed 1,200 Israelis were killed and 251 people taken hostage.
What have they done? Their children. 7-year-old and 12-year-old children. The oldest one among them was in her first year of university. They're all civilians.
Trying to survive relentless airstrikes, food shortages, and outbreak of disease, the people of Gaza are exhausted.
This is the second time and we are living in the street. They're saying we are with you, Gaza, but where are the Arab countries? We do not want aid. We want the war to stop. Stop the war. We are tired.
Every day, the death toll has risen, with over 41,000 killed, 70% of which are believed to be women and children, despite Israel's stated goal of targeting Hamas. Social media has been flooded with daily images of death and destruction. Protests have taken place across the globe for the past 12 months. A brief break in the fighting came during a temporary ceasefire. 105 hostages were released in a deal in November 2023. Others have been rescued or set free, but many are still being held by Hamas. Israel wants all hostages released. Until then, there's no sign of the war abating and a permanent ceasefire.
We have lost our moral compass on Gaza, as a humanity, as the international community, and we need to do something about that fast.
Western governments have come under pressure from campaign groups to halt arms sales to Israel. The new UK Labour government, led by Sir Keir Starmer, implemented a partial stop on arms sales, but campaigners say the decision doesn't go far enough. 1 year on from October 7th, when will this nightmare end for the people in Gaza, and who can bring both sides back to the negotiating table?
Well, let's meet our guests. In Ramallah, Diana Buttu is a human rights lawyer and former spokesperson for the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO. Omar Barghouti is the co-founder of the Palestinian Boycott, Divestment, Sanction Movement, BDS. And in Geneva, we have Lara Elborno. She's a Palestinian-American international lawyer and activist. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Diana, I'll come to you first. I read that 1 in 55 Gazans who were alive a year ago are now dead, and Associated Press are reporting that there are at least 60 Gazan families who have lost more than 25 members. The numbers here, every single one a life lost, it's a catastrophe off the scale.
Absolutely. And I wouldn't be surprised if the number is actually higher than that. You know, it might be 1 out of 55 who's been killed, but it's every single person who's been devastated by this genocide, because that is precisely what Israel's wanted to do. This is an attack against the Palestinian people. They want to be able to commit genocide and ethnic cleansing, and they've been allowed to commit genocide and ethnic cleansing. When you look today and you look at the largest Palestinian city, which is Gaza City, it doesn't exist any longer. We have so much rubble that the UN is estimating that it's going to take a minimum of 15 years just to clear the rubble. And this is just damage just to buildings. What about the damage to lives, especially to children who've lived in a world now where they see that the world does not want them to be alive. And so this has been an absolutely devastating year for Palestinians. And the fact that the world continues to let it happen is such an indictment against the international system as we know it, and against Israel in particular.
Omar, that word genocide that Diana just used there, is it even a debate anymore as to whether or not what has happened in Gaza is a genocide?
Only the genocidal axis, the United States, Israel, and the European partners in genocide are the ones debating this. But in the human rights community at large, in civil society across the world, the absolute majority of humanity sees that Israel is perpetrating not just genocide, it's the world's first televised genocide. And that takes it to a different level because it brings in the issue of complicity. Even the UN Secretary General says we're entering an era of total impunity, an age of chaos. So when someone as conservative as the Secretary General of the UN uses those terms, you know that the complicity has reached such an extreme level. So in addition to wrecking the lives, destroying tens of thousands of Palestinian lives and the livelihoods of millions of Palestinians, and now the Lebanese as well, Israel is also wrecking, with US support and European support, the fundamental pillars of international law, no less. They're taking us to an era of might makes right, where everyone should be concerned.
Lara, just come in on the issue of genocide. What are your thoughts?
Well, I would absolutely echo what Omar has said. I mean, you know, in the first few months of this assault, so much of my interventions and the interventions of other activists and scholars and lawyers was to set out all the elements of genocide and to prove point by point how what we were seeing in Palestine met those elements. And we would come in on interviews speaking about how 800 genocide scholars had signed a letter saying that Israel was committing genocide, how now 47 state crime scholars have come out and said that Israel's committing a genocide. And we were accumulating all of the support for this notion. And I think by now the debate is so moot because the world largely recognizes that what we're seeing is this live stream genocide. Of course, in the context, and I think that's very important for people to understand, of an illegal occupation, an apartheid regime, the continued denial for over 76 years of the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. And so when we look at this holistically, we have to understand that what's at stake here really is humanity. It's not only about the Palestinian people. And if we care about humanity, we have to reject Zionism, which can only be defined by the material reality that it has created on the ground, and the implementation of which is going to result in disastrous consequences for people around the world who won't be able to escape its reach, because essentially everything that Israel does and gets away with in Palestine becomes a new blueprint for vulnerable people worldwide. We've seen them now export their genocide to Lebanon, displacing over 1 million people in a matter of days, killing over 500 people in one day by leveling totally 6 residential buildings. This, of course, doesn't even mention the terrorist pager attacks. This doesn't mention the political assassinations that are now being committed on a weekly basis, it seems. So the world that we're living in now is a deeply dangerous one, and it concerns all of us.
Just, Lara, on that point, the Israelis say they have a right to defend themselves. What do you say to that?
Well, of course they say that, but then there's also the question of what the law actually says. It's really unfortunate that we have to keep dispelling this myth, because the reality is that under international law, Israel does not enjoy a right of self-defense in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter in relation to attacks emanating from a territory that it occupies. The ICJ was express about that in its Wall opinion, and Israel occupies Gaza and the West Bank. And that's also not up for debate. It's been reaffirmed by the ICJ as recently as July 19th, 2024, in its illegality opinion. But I think what you're highlighting speaks to the tremendous dehumanization of the Palestinian people in the Western discourse. And if I can just give one example, it was perfectly highlighted by the fact that Western leaders expressed more outrage in one day in relation to the recent Iranian attack, which killed no Israelis and targeted instead Israeli F-35s and military bases, than they were able to muster in an entire year of watching Palestinian families be systematically incinerated, vaporized, and targeted. And so essentially, the West is more sympathetic to the preservation of Israeli warplanes, which represent, of course, its own imperial aspirations, than they are to the flesh and blood of Palestinian children. And so that's why you continue to hear Israel engaging in this rhetoric of we have a right to defend itself. So what they're really saying is that we have a right to commit genocide.
Diana, are you worried that as the media moves on now to coverage of the war in Lebanon and everything that's happening between Israel and Hezbollah and Iran, do you worry that the media spotlight will move off Gaza and Gaza may be forgotten about?
The media spotlight moved off of Gaza quite a long time ago, with the fact that all of the attention has always been on Israel and on Israeli lives, and very little attention paid to what it's like to live daily under a system of genocide. So this isn't anything new. I do want there to be obviously attention to Lebanon, because Israel is once again carrying out war crimes in Lebanon. It has already pushed for ethnic cleansing in the southern part of Lebanon. It's carrying out massive war crimes in the southern part of Lebanon as well. And so it's important for the world to also pay attention to Lebanon. But Lebanon is not separate or apart from Gaza. They are one and the same. And that one and the same being that Israel seeks to get rid of as many Palestinians, as many Lebanese as possible. And the ethos of Zionism is to create an even bigger, what they would call Jewish state. So yes, I'm very disappointed at the media, but this isn't anything new. The fact that we have spent the past year literally begging for the world to pay attention to children's bodies that have been mangled by Israeli bombs, rather than focusing on some of the military losses that Israel has sustained.
Omar, just on that point, do you think this is the Israeli game plan to create an even larger Jewish state by all of this?
Well, Israel as a settler colony established on Palestinian homeland since 1948, the game plan for all settler colonies is to get rid of the indigenous population as quickly as possible and whenever it's convenient. So Israel is finding this moment where it has total support from the US government and most European governments, and especially the settler colonies, US, Canada, and Australia. It sees that this is the opportunity to get rid of as many indigenous people as possible, either by killing us, destroying our lives, or ethnically cleansing us, whether in Gaza or the West Bank, or even within the 1948 border, where Israel continues gradually its ethnic cleansing project. So maximum land, minimum Arabs has always been the slogan of the Zionist settler colonial movement. They were very honest about that. And now they see an opportunity of actually implementing it en masse. But the main point is that Israel cannot do this, cannot get away with this without the complicity of states, corporations, and institutions. It's not just the arming and the funding and the whitewashing and the justifying that presidents and prime ministers in the West have been doing. It's material support. And as Lara mentioned, it's the dehumanization of Palestinian lives. As Diana said, tens of thousands of Palestinian lives lost does not register on the radar of the West's ethics, because that ethics is extremely racist to begin with.
Lara, just pick up on a phrase that Omar used there, maximum land, minimum Arabs. Do you think that is the game plan from day one?
Yeah, I mean, here it's important to turn back to the history and understand that when Zionism was conceived as a political ideology, since inception, it's been framed as a colonial movement. People are familiar with the headline, "Zionists will colonize Palestine," as it was a headline that was printed very, very openly in what was considered the mainstream media of the time at the turn of the 19th century. But the reality here is that you see it play out every single day. We've seen it play out every single day for the last 76 years. Every single policy that Israel adopts vis-a-vis the Palestinians can be understood as being motivated by the desire to remove Palestinians from their land and prevent them from returning. And that is the case for millions of Palestinians in forced exile worldwide, including in neighboring Arab countries who have been subject to permanent forced displacement and prevented from returning to their land, or subjecting those that remain on their land to this system of racial supremacy, occupation, domination, and ensuring that they remain disenfranchised and subjected, essentially invisible, so that only one tier of people has rights on the land. There's 7 million people living, Palestinian people living between the river and the sea right now. And the world largely sees them as living under an apartheid regime. But the game plan here is to get rid of them. Just as Israel got rid of 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 and prevented them from returning. The difficulty is that for 76 years, they haven't really been able to do so. But as mentioned by my panelists, right now, Israel sees an opportunity to be able to execute its ambitions for all the land, or as much of it as possible, with as little Palestinians as possible.
Diana, people have always been astounded by the resilience of the Palestinian people, but at what point do they reach breaking point?
Even just the idea that somehow Palestinians need to be resilient is dehumanizing, because it's placing the onus on Palestinians to withstand rather than placing the onus on Israel to stop, or on the international community to force Israel to stop. Omar, my co-panelist, said something very important, which is that none of this could have been possible without the support, financial and otherwise, financial, diplomatic and otherwise, of the West, primarily the United States. And so the idea that Palestinians have to somehow remain resilient rather than forcing Israel to end is, again, turning things on its head. Palestinians shouldn't have to be resilient. We should be able to live our lives just like any people around the world in freedom. And to demand otherwise of this is once again a form of dehumanization.
Omar, just bring us up to speed with the boycott movement, BDS. What kind of a 12 months have you had?
It's very hard to summarize in a very short period of time, but I'll try. Since we've been planting the seeds of ending complicity for 19 years, the BDS movement, with its many partners around the world, counting in the tens of millions, literally, who support groups that are part of the BDS movement, when Israel started the genocide, people around the world, civil society, organizations, students, academics, artists, feminists, climate justice movement, Black justice movement, everyone was ready with the tools to face this genocide. So it wasn't just the massive demonstrations like the ones we've seen in London and Washington, Jakarta, and across the world, in Yemen, in Morocco, Egypt, and so on. It wasn't just that. It was also the tools of targeting companies that are most complicit, governments that are most complicit. So the pressure in Canada, for example, forced Parliament to pass a military embargo resolution, regardless how much government is really obeying that or not. The Norwegian pension fund, the largest sovereign fund in the world, divested entirely from Israel government bonds, some $500 million. Intel Corporation was forced to cancel a $25 billion, with a B, $25 billion project near Tel Aviv under massive pressure, including BDS pressure. And I can go on and on and on, other than the tens of thousands of academics and artists and many universities. For the first time, thanks to the student encampments, many universities have cut relations with Israel for the first time in history. And many have divested from military companies and other companies that are directly complicit in Israel's genocide, apartheid, or settler colonialism. So we're seeing a lot of traction. It hasn't been enough to stop the genocide, but we are getting closer to that tipping point, and we cannot give up hope.
Lara, let's look at the international community. How have you felt seeing so many key countries not get involved, turn a blind eye, in many cases actually support what Israel has been doing?
Well, I don't think it's so many countries. I think it's a handful of countries that have a tremendous amount of power. And I would agree with Omar that in the last year, we've seen worldwide support for the Palestinian struggle for freedom. primarily from the global South, but across civil society movements in the West, including the what seems like weekly demonstrations and the student encampments, which have been consistent for months and become really the latest manifestation of BDS as a form of resistance. And I think that more people are critical of Zionism than ever before and seeing it for what it is. A political ideology that is responsible for the establishment and maintenance and expansion of the Israeli settler colony in Palestine. I think on the other hand, in the West, we've seen that the US and Israel are willing to light the entire region on fire and potentially the entire world before considering adopting a policy whereby Palestinians are free. And the only question I have is how far the US will go before it decides to abandon this hopeless policy of supporting Israel at all costs with no red lines for any of its internationally wrongful conduct.
Diana, can I ask, how much of all of this do you think is Netanyahu keeping himself in a job? This constant state of conflict, bombings, invasions. Netanyahu must surely know that as soon as the war stops, he's out of a job because of what happened a year ago.
Yes, indeed. And that explains part, but not all of it. Look, part of it is, as you said, there were a number of protests that were happening throughout the country, having nothing to do, by the way, with Palestinians. They don't care about Palestinians, but simply to do with issues of corruption. And it's very likely that he will end up serving prison time, once again, not for any of the war crimes that he's committed against Palestinians, but for internal corruption matters. And so on the one hand, he is keen to have this continue so that he can remain in office and therefore never see the inside of a prison. But on the other hand, he's also continuing because Israeli society hasn't said stop. I think we give them too much credit if somehow we think that Israelis want to see an end to this, when it's quite the opposite. We haven't seen any anti-war protests. We haven't seen people coming out and saying that they're opposed to assassinations. We haven't seen them come out saying that they're opposed to genocide. It's been exactly the opposite, a year of cheerleading this government on, occasionally being upset with the government for not doing enough to bring home the Israelis, but at the same time cheering on the government wholeheartedly. So it's in part because he wants to stay in office, but in part because the Israeli public wants him to stay in office as well.
Omar, just come in on that. I mean, that's a terrible phrase to hear, cheerleading a genocide effectively. I mean, do you think that's what the Israeli public have been doing in all of this?
Yes, the Israeli public has been genocidal in its intent for decades. I mean, since inception. During the Nakba, Israel committed genocidal acts against the indigenous Palestinians to expel, to ethnically cleanse the absolute majority, especially from the area that became the State of Israel then. So the genocidal trait, if you will, is built in a settler colony. It's by definition, any settler colony has part of its DNA this genocidal part, this genocidal attribute. Now, whether they get to enact it or not depends on opportunity, depends whether they think they can get away with it or not. Currently, the absolute majority of Israeli settler society, that is across both parts of the Green Line, believes strongly that they can get away with not just murder, with genocide. They really think that they have, Congress in our pocket, we can do anything we wish. But this wishful thinking is kind of suicidal in a way. The settler colony, by committing this open genocide, televised genocide, is committing suicide as a settler colony. There's no coming back from that moment when this state is now considered a genocide state, not just an apartheid state. The world cannot deal with it as a normal part of humanity any longer.
Lara, where are we in terms of a ceasefire? I mean, 1 year into the war in Gaza now, there's been hope before, it's been dashed. Where do you think we stand right now?
Well, I think one of the Israeli politicians said maybe a week ago that the policy now was de-escalation through escalation. So I think that about summarizes hopes for a ceasefire at this moment. And if you're speaking about on the international plane, we know that for many, many months, the US obstructed efforts to reach a ceasefire resolution before the UN Security Council, before finally one was passed in June. But of course, it was never implemented. And the reason for that is because there's no incentive to do so. Just a week ago, the US transferred another $8.7 billion in a military aid package to Israel. And we're now nearly a year into this genocide. And so long as the weapons keep flowing, the money keeps flowing to Israel, the diplomatic protection, the intelligence cooperation, the material support, there will be no incentive to comply with its international obligations, despite the fact that they are clear, despite the fact that we have a number of provisional measures orders rendered in the genocide case brought by South Africa, and Israel has not complied with a single one. So just to give the listeners an idea, the International Court of Justice ordered Israel to cease genocidal acts, prevent and punish genocidal incitement, to refrain from invading Rafah, to ensure that the Rafah crossing remained open, and to make sure that humanitarian aid was delivered in Gaza to prevent famine and starvation. And what do we know that happened? We know that not only did Israel continue genocidal acts, it also invaded Rafah. And I encourage everyone to look at satellite photos of before and after the Israeli invasion of Rafah. We also know that Israel, instead of keeping the Rafah crossing open, actually destroyed it completely, and it's been closed since May, with the disastrous consequences on the Palestinian people who are injured and need to travel for medical treatment. We also know that Israel continues to obstruct humanitarian aid into Gaza. This is OCHA's reports from September, just a few weeks ago, publishing that Israel continues to prevent the entry of humanitarian aid, including food and medicine, and that 500,000 people in Gaza are still suffering from famine at this present time, with everybody.
Diana, Omar and Lara, thank you all so much for your insight on this. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me, Enda Brady, and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.